presentation, which deals with the question how to design and administer online exams in law. And what I intend to do in this presentation is to discuss the problems connected with the administration of online exams in general, and in law in particular, and to suggest various innovative solutions to these problems based on my own experience, as well as that of other Israeli law professors. Now, as a result of this crisis, the Israeli academia, just like in most other countries, were all forced to stop all the teaching and examination on campus and to move to online solutions. Now, the transition to online teaching using mainly applications such as Zoom and Moodle went relatively smoothly. However, the attempts to administer online exams, in contrast, they proved to be much more difficult. And the main concern relates to the academic integrity of the exams and to difficulties in preventing use of unauthorized aids, communication between students, and other types of cheating. And because of these concerns, some professors gave up completely and just decided to give pass grades to all students. For instance, in the computer science department in my university, it was decided that it was absolutely impossible to administer online exams that would not compromise on the integrity of the exam. And therefore, in all of the first year mandatory courses taught in the first semester, all the students received created a serious headache for them in how to administer their selection process for advancement to the second year. We're usually very strict and meticulous and is meant to leave only the very best in the program. And also in the faculty of law, many professors just gave up and decided to give binary pass or fail grades based on very partial assignments that students had submitted before the crisis. And some even gave pass marks without there having to be any assignments and anything to base this on. So this, and the fact that we, unfortunately, maybe we don't see the end yet of this crisis, it has convinced me that we have a problem here that requires attention and some out-of-box solution to this problem. So I'm going to, my presentation will be structured first talking about the problems a little bit, and then about some of the technical solutions to the problem, and then to the more substantive solutions in relation to issues of integrity. How do you write an exam in a way that won't be amenable to cheating, basically? Let me talk first a little bit about technical difficulties. I don't want to spend too much time on technicalities of online exams, but suffice it to say that here in Israel, we use the Moodle learning management system, and it enables also to administer online exams, both for open-ended questions and writing tasks, and also for multiple choice exams. The exam can be released to the students at a predetermined time, and their answers have to be submitted at the time determined by the teacher. The system will simply close at the end of the time if you program it to do so. But the system also allows you to give extra time to students that are entitled to certain time extensions. And also, it's interesting, it includes a system of originality examination, which can detect plagiarism and copying from other exams or from external sources. It just compares the test to a big collection of material that it has in the computer. Now, it's very important that not only the teacher learns how to use the system ahead of giving such an exam in order to know how to do it and how to take advantage of all the possibilities the system does give you, but it's also important that the students get an opportunity to experience it ahead of the exam under non-pressure circumstances. So therefore, I highly recommend to carry out what I call an exam drill for the students before the real exam, to give them an opportunity to get to know the system, how to access the exam, how to answer it, how to submit it. And from my experience, I can tell you that it really helps to reduce test anxiety among the students. They're afraid maybe I won't manage, how if I can't submit a test in time, et cetera, et cetera. And it will minimize also technical problems with the submission. And I used the drill also to give my students an exercise in the study material itself. I just gave them an exam from past years, which they could answer and submit. Now, if you have the time and the motivation, you can also check this drill exam briefly in order to give the students feedback on how they're doing, how they're understanding the material ahead of the actual real exam. Or alternatively, you can distribute these drill exams among the students so that the peers will check the test of a friend and mark them, which could prompt them to discuss questions among themselves and come up with the best answers, which is a nice way of group study. Now, I want to turn to the integrity issue and to the question how to design the exam in a way that will not be amenable to cheating. If the students are sitting at home with nobody watching over them, how can you prevent them from copying from books, summaries, or from online material? How can you prevent them from passing answers between themselves during the exam, using email, smartphone messaging, and other modes of communication? And how can you verify the identity of the person who actually writes the exam? Now, I'm not saying that all students are, are dishonest, but even if you have 10 or 20% who are, that also is not fair, that they should get marks that really they're not entitled to. And it also creates a bad spirit inside the class and might then convince other students, honest students maybe, to cut corners and to do the same. Now, there are some technological solutions to this. These are systems that are called remote proctoring systems. They can be found in the market, but most universities have not yet purchased them. These systems require the students to install a special software on the computers. And when the exam begins, the software accesses the student's computer and its camera, and it keeps the student under camera supervision throughout the exam, recording all his movements. You may have a person also sitting there of the university, of the company, who is watching the student and can even talk to him if he sees something strange and improper. And the student is required to confirm his identity by holding up an ID to the camera or through biometric authentication, including, for instance, facial recognition. And there is a lockdown mechanism which you can use to prevent students from accessing web browsers or other applications in the computer so that they only will write the exam. Now, there has been some criticism of these systems as being overly intrusive, harming the privacy of students and ethical issues. So generally a prior consent is required in order to use them on part of the student. This may serve as an obstacle in addition to the economic obstacle of the system's high price for regular universities, especially when we were caught unexpected with this COVID-19 pandemic. Unlike, for instance, programs that had planned to have online exams, programs that are entirely online teaching, then they can have the students sign such consents. There is a primitive alternative to a full-fledged remote proctoring system, which was used by some professors in some colleges here in Israel, and that is to require the students to write the exams while connected to Zoom with open cameras. This too was met by opposition by many of the student organizations, and frankly, it's not very effective in preventing cheating for various reasons that I don't have time to elaborate on here. So given a situation where we must administer an online exam without having an effective proctoring system, supervising system, what is one to do? Well, the general rule is to design an exam which requires something very individual, something very unique from each student, something that is not uniform for them all. Because an exam that gives all the students the same questions, which require more or less the same answers, that's like an open door that may tempt even a saint. True, we do ask them to sign a declaration of honesty in the beginning of the exam, namely that they promise not to use any prohibited material, to get assistance from anyone but themselves in writing the exam. It has some value probably, but still, giving questions the ready answers for which can be found on the web, in the reading material, or in students' course summaries, is also not a good idea for an online non-proctor exam. And really what we should do in these type of assignments is to require original, individualized thinking from the students, which produces non-uniform answers. And this will prevent cooperation, illicit cooperation. So let me share with you my own experience. In the first semester this year, I taught 2 different courses in tort law. Now, usually my exams are with open material, and they're made up of 2 questions. One that represents 70% of the final mark is a case question. In other words, it's a made-up story that I made up involving bodily harm or damage to property, where students are required to identify the tortfeasors, the potential claimants, and the type of torts committed, and to analyze them in view of the facts of the case, the law, and all the relevant jurisprudence. They're then asked to discuss possible defenses, again, based on the facts of the case, to provide the principles on how to calculate the damages. And then there's a second question, 30%, which focuses more on tort theory and policy. That requires students to explain some doctrine or some question that I come up with or judgment in view of the main theories of tort law. Now, both of these types of questions have more or less standard solutions, and the students' responses are examined in view of these standard solutions with a certain amount of openness to some divergences that make sense, that are well explained, but all in all, it's more or less a standard answer. Now, it was very clear to me from the outset that this was not a type of exam that I could give as an online non-proctored exam. So what I did was the following. Instead of making up my own tort story, I asked the students to make up their own story. I just gave them general instructions on what the story had to be made up of. So it had to be a story where the victim of the tort was killed by the tort. It had to include so and so many different torts. It had to include contributory negligence by the victim. And it had to involve uncertain causality. I encouraged them to be original by promising bonus points for original and well thought out stories. The students were then requested to discuss and analyze the story that they had made up and to reach conclusions. As expected, each student came up with a different story, and consequently, the analysis and relevant legal sources were different for each exam. Now we come to damages. In order to calculate damages in such a situation, one needs to know the age of the victim. So I instructed the students that the age of the victim was equal to the last digit of their ID number multiplied by 5. Now, if the last digit of their ID number was 0, you can't multiply by 0, it will remain at 0. So I told them to refer to it as though it was 10. So this way, each student had to calculate damages based on a different age of the victim, ranging from 5 to 50. And this also had a bearing on whether the victim was married, had children. They could decide for themselves how many children they had, and that also affects the calculation. So here, there is no place for cooperation because everyone has a different story and a different analysis. For the second question, I asked the students to choose one of the judgments that we had discussed during the course, describe its fact, the central legal question that it dealt with, what the court ruled on this question, and how it reached its conclusion. Then I asked them to discuss this conclusion in view of the central theories of tort law and to express their views on whether they agreed with the outcome. And by the way, all throughout the exam, I was available to answer questions from the students by email in case something was unclear to them. I think the experience with this exam was very good. The grades were reasonable, not much different from my regular exams, perhaps slightly lower, but that was corrected in the appeals procedure. Now, admittedly, to mark those exams, it demands more knowledge and discretion than what is usually required from a teacher, a teaching assistant whose only job is to compare the students' answers to a given standard solution, which I have prepared, and then to mark them accordingly. So here, they need to be more, know more and to be more, have more discretion. And because of that, and because I thought that in this case, my TA had been a little bit too strict, I found myself accepting more appeals than I usually do, adding a few points to some of the exams. Some of the students claimed that the exam was more difficult than usually. And it was, in the sense they had to come up with the case by themselves. But I had taken off, they actually had less components of the case than I usually give them. And also I added another half an hour to the exam, so they would be able to cope with that. So those are the advantages. What are the disadvantages? Well, I did not have a way to ascertain the identity of the person who wrote the exam. I couldn't prevent the students from getting assistance from third persons, people who were not writing the exam, such as an experienced lawyer or an advanced year student. But the likelihood of that happening and of such a person being able to respond properly to the exam, not having taken my course this year, is not very high. In order to, if you really want to hermetically prevent such a possibility, you would need a very sophisticated remote proctoring system, which was not available to me. Another lecturer that I interviewed took a somewhat similar approach, but combined it with testing the ability of the student to use legal databases, which is very important in this time and age. So he asked his students to find a judgment in the database that had not been discussed in class, but dealt with a certain legal issue that he defined for them. Since there was a significant number of such judgments, it was unlikely that two students could come up with the same judgment. So again, everyone has their own judgment and they have to describe the facts, holding of the case, and to classify it according to some of the various approaches to this legal question that the professor had taught in class, and to answer some other general questions about this holding of the case. There were also other lecturers who decided to use multiple choice questions in their online exams. And they too found ways to design and administer the exam in such a way as to minimize the chances of illicit cooperation or use of prohibited material. These used mixing of questions, mixing of the answers, preventing the possibility to return to a question once you answered it, and a short time for completing the exam, which leaves no time to request answers from others or to bribe them. And the professor using this type of exams, they reported satisfaction both on their part and on behalf of their students, with no indication of illicit cooperation. I intend to elaborate more on this in a paper that I'm working with that I hope to upload to SSRN. So if you're interested, you will be able to find more details and more ideas and suggestions of how to do this in an effective way. So I have finished my presentation. If there are any questions by chat, I'm happy to answer them. Okay, I see here a question. Did you warn the students that they would need to prepare a story? No, I didn't. On purpose, I didn't. First of all, I think that the surprise that I took them by was also helpful in preventing dishonesty, because they wouldn't expect what I had prepared for them. Because if I told them ahead of time, they could prepare the story ahead of time, and that would not be what I had in mind. I know, by the way, that the professor who asked the students to search for judgments in the database, in the legal database, he did tell them ahead of time that he's going to do that. He didn't tell them what he wants them to look for, but he told them that that will be part of the exam. And I think that is very legitimate. Coming back to this general topic of this conference, which is also technology, in this time and age, a law student has to have very good capabilities of using legal databases and know how to search for legal material, for judgments, for laws, etc. So I think that's absolutely legitimate, and it's actually a very good idea to ask students to do that as part of the exam. And I might consider using that in the future. Are there any other questions? You are asked to send the questions by chat. Okay.